You wake in darkness, not the darkness of a closed door or a turned-off lamp. The darkness of stone walls, a single oil flame, and no separation between where you sleep and where your family cooks, prays, and keeps the animals that keep you alive. This wasn't poverty. This was normal. In 50 AD Judea, the house you lived in had no hallways, no separate rooms, no place to be alone. One space, one family, and often one goat standing 3 feet from where your children slept. The homes of Jesus' world weren't the sun-drenched courtyards of cinema. They were small, dark, and shared, not just with your extended family, but with the smell of smoke, dung, and bodies pressed close in the night. This is what shelter actually looked like. Most families in 1st century Judea lived in a single room, not a large room. Roughly 12 by 15 feet, stone walls, packed earth below, a low ceiling of wooden beams covered with thatch or mud. Everything happened here. You cooked your lentils over a small fire in the corner. You ate sitting on the floor. You worked, spinning, weaving, mending, in the dim light from the doorway. And when night came, you unrolled woven mats and slept shoulder to shoulder with your parents, your siblings, your grandparents. There were no beds, no separate spaces for children, no room where you could close a door. The house had one entrance, a low wooden door you had to stoop to pass through. In winter, you covered it with a woven curtain to keep out wind. In summer, you left it open to let in what little air moved through the valley. Some homes had a second level, a wooden platform built into one end of the room, raised about 2 feet off the ground. This is where the family slept. Below it, in the lower section, you kept your animals, your donkey, your goat, your sheep if you had one. They lived with you, not in a separate barn, not outside in a pen, in the same room where you slept, ate, and raised your children. At night, you could hear them breathing, shifting, the sound of hooves on stone, the smell of wool and dung rising through the floorboards. This wasn't cruelty, it was security. Animals were wealth. If you left them outside, they could be stolen or killed. So you brought them in. You slept above them. You woke to their sounds. And you accepted that privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. The floor beneath your feet wasn't wood or tile. It was dirt, packed earth, hardened by years of footsteps, smoothed by constant sweeping. In wealthier homes, you might find flat stones fitted together, but most families walked on the ground itself. Every day, you swept it. Dust from the road, bits of straw, ash from the cooking fire. The floor required maintenance the way a garden does because it was never truly finished. When it rained, the dirt turned to mud. Water seeped under the door, dripped through gaps in the roof, pooled in the corners where the floor met the walls. You waited for it to dry, then swept again, smoothing the surface with your feet until it hardened once more. The walls were stone, not dressed stone, carved and fitted, rough field stone, whatever you could gather from the hillside or pull from the ground while clearing a field. You stacked them without mortar or held them together with mud mixed with straw. The stones were uneven. The walls were thick, sometimes 2 feet deep, because that's what it took to make them stable. They kept out some of the heat in summer, some of the cold in winter, but they didn't keep out sound, or smell, or the awareness that you were never alone. The house had small openings near the roofline, not windows as we know them. No glass existed for common homes, just gaps in the stone, maybe a foot wide, sometimes covered with wooden shutters. You opened them when you needed air. You closed them when the wind came, or when night fell, and you wanted to keep what little warmth the cooking fire provided. This meant a choice, always: suffocate in still air or shiver in the draft. Most of the day, the house remained dim. Sunlight entered only through the door and those small openings. Shadows filled the corners. You worked by feel as much as by sight, your hands learning the textures of wool, grain, clay. When the door was closed, darkness came quickly, and the walls, those thick, uneven stones, pressed close. There was no expanding the space, no knocking through to another room. What you built was what you had. 12 by 15 feet, dirt below, stone around, a low ceiling of beams and thatch above. This was the container of your entire domestic life. The animals lived here too, not outside in a pen, not in a separate structure, in the same room where you slept. At the lower end of the house, where the floor dropped 2 feet below the raised platform, your family kept its livestock. A goat, usually. Maybe a sheep. A donkey, if you were fortunate enough to own one. They stood on bare stone or packed earth. You fed them there. They urinated there. Their dung collected in the corners until you scraped it out and carried it away. The smell never left. Dung and urine, wet wool. The sour-sweet scent of animals breathing in an enclosed space. It mixed with the smoke from your cooking fire and the sweat of bodies that bathed infrequently. You didn't notice it the way a stranger would. You'd lived with it since birth. It was the smell of home. But it was there, always. The animals made noise through the night, shifting hooves on stone, the low bleat of a goat, the donkey's breath, loud, rhythmic, close enough to hear from where you slept on the platform above. If a goat gave birth, it happened 3 feet from where your children lay on their mats. If an animal grew sick, you tended it in the dark, your oil lamp casting shadows against the stone walls while your family tried to sleep. This wasn't neglect, it was necessity. Animals were wealth. A goat provided milk, cheese, and eventually meat or trade value. A donkey carried water, grain, and firewood. A sheep gave wool, if you left them outside. Overnight, they could be stolen. Predators, jackals, wolves hunted the hills. Thieves moved between villages under cover of darkness, so you brought them inside. You built your home with them in mind. The lower level wasn't an afterthought. It was designed as their space. The raised platform where you slept kept you above the worst of the mess and gave you a few feet of separation. But separation is not isolation. You heard them, smelled them, woke to them. Your wealth, your survival, slept beneath you, and you accepted the cost. Because the alternative was losing everything. Light was scarce, not dim, scarce. The sun rose, and if your door faced east, a shaft of brightness entered for a few hours. It moved across the dirt floor as the morning progressed, illuminating dust in the air, the texture of stone, the faces of your family as they worked. Then it shifted, narrowed, disappeared. By midday, unless you left the door open, the house returned to shadow. You had one reliable source of light after sunset, An olive oil lamp, a small clay bowl no larger than your palm, a wick of twisted flax floating in oil pressed from the previous harvest. It produced a flame the size of your thumbnail. That flame lit a radius of perhaps 3 feet. Beyond that, darkness. If you needed to move across the room at night, you carried the lamp. If you set it down to work, you bent close, mending a tear in fabric, grinding grain, searching for something dropped on the floor. One lamp, carefully tended, consumed about 1/4 cup of oil per night. You couldn't afford to waste it, so you lit it only when necessary, and you extinguished it before sleep. Most of your waking hours, you lived in semi-darkness. Your eyes adjusted. You learned the layout of the room by touch and memory. You knew where the water jars stood, where the grinding stones rested, where the fire smoldered in its corner. But you couldn't read, couldn't see faces clearly across the room, couldn't do fine work after the sun set. The cooking fire provided some light, but its primary job wasn't illumination. It was heat, and food, and smoke. You built your fire in one corner of the room, often on a raised stone platform or inside a small clay oven. You fed it with wood when you had it, olive wood, dried vine cuttings, thorns gathered from the hills. When wood was scarce, you burned dried dung, goat dung, donkey dung, collected, shaped into patties, dried in the sun, then stacked near the fire for fuel. It burned. It gave heat. It produced acrid smoke that rose toward the ceiling and spread through the room. There was no chimney. The smoke drifted upward, seeped through gaps in the thatch, filtered out through the small openings near the roofline. But much of it lingered, hovering in the upper part of the room, irritating your eyes, coating the walls with soot. You breathed it. Every day. Every night. Your eyes stung. Your throat grew raw. Respiratory infections were common, especially in winter when you kept the door closed against the cold, and the smoke had nowhere to go. Children born in these homes inhaled smoke from their first breath. Women who spent their days cooking, leaning over the fire, tending the pot, suffered the worst of it. Chronic cough, scarred lungs, eyes that watered constantly. This was the cost of warmth, of cooked food, of survival. You didn't complain. You didn't have language for indoor air quality. You simply lived with it, the way you lived with the smell of animals and the dirt under your feet. The fire burned low through the night. You banked it with ash to preserve the coals, so you wouldn't have to start it fresh in the morning. And when darkness came, full darkness, after the oil lamp was extinguished, you lay on your mat in a room thick with smoke, listening to your family breathe, the animals shift below, the wind press against the door. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you knew exactly where you were. Privacy was not a concept you lived by. It wasn't something you lost or sacrificed. It simply didn't exist as a category of experience. You were born in this room. Your mother's labor, the sounds, the blood, the midwife's hands, happened while your siblings slept on mats against the wall, while your grandmother tended the fire, while the goat shifted in the lower level. Birth was not private. Neither was illness. When fever came, you lay on your mat in the center of the room. Your family stepped over you, worked around you, spoke above you. They brought water, pressed cool cloths to your forehead, prayed. You sweated through your clothes, vomited into a clay bowl. moaned in the night. Everyone heard, everyone saw. There was no separate room for the sick, no door to close, no way to suffer alone. And when death came, it came here too. Your grandfather's final breath was drawn in the same space where you'd eaten breakfast that morning. His body was washed and wrapped while you watched. It lay in the room until burial, sometimes hours, sometimes a full day if the death occurred at night. You smelled it. You sat with it. You learned that death was not an abstraction, but a presence that occupied the same 12 by 15 feet you occupied. Marriage brought no escape. When a son married, he often remained in his father's house. A new mat was unrolled. The young wife joined the family in the same room. Intimacy, what little could be managed, happened in darkness, in silence, with the awareness that your parents lay 3 feet away, that your younger siblings breathed in the corner, that the rhythm of bodies could be heard even when faces couldn't be seen. This was normal. You didn't feel violated. You didn't know you were supposed to. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. In Jerusalem, in the upper city, some homes had multiple rooms. Separate spaces for sleeping, for cooking, for receiving guests. Walls that divided, doors that closed. But those homes belonged to merchants, to temple officials, to the few families who controlled land and trade. For everyone else, for the farmers, the laborers, the shepherds, the vast majority of people who lived in villages scattered across the Judean hills, there was one room, shared space, shared sound, shared air. You learned to exist in the presence of others. You developed no expectation of solitude. You had no vocabulary for, "I need to be alone." When you needed to relieve yourself, you stepped outside, into the courtyard if the house had one, or onto the hillside if it didn't. That was the only separation, a few moments away from the room under open sky. Then you returned to the fire, the smoke, the animals. The family pressed close. You slept with your brother's elbow against your ribs, your mother's breath in your ear, your father's snoring filling the space above you. You woke to the same faces you'd seen the night before. You worked beside them, ate with them, prayed with them. And when darkness came, you lay down in the same order, in the same positions, your body learning the contours of the mat, the cool of the dirt floor beneath, the warmth of your sister's back against yours. This was the container of your life, not a room you passed through, not a space you could leave. This was where you lived, all of you, together, with no door to close, no corner to claim as your own, no moment when you could say, "I am alone," because you weren't. You never were. The house you've just walked through, the one room, the dirt floor, the smoke, the animals, the bodies pressed close, wasn't an exception. It was the rule. This was how the vast majority of people in Jesus' world actually lived. Not in the sun-washed courtyards of biblical epics, not in the romanticized stone cottages with wooden tables and bright textiles hanging from the walls, in cramped darkness, in shared air, in spaces we would find unlivable. They had no concept of square footage per person, no building codes, no expectation that a child deserved a room of their own or that a married couple should have privacy. They built what they could with the materials they had. They lived in it. They adapted. And they called it home. Because home wasn't defined by comfort or separation or the luxury of solitude. It was defined by survival, by the people who shared your mat, by the animals whose breath you heard in the night, by the fire that kept you warm enough to wake up and do it all again. We've seen the container now, the walls, the floor, the dim light and thick smoke. Next, we'll look at what actually happened inside those walls. What did families cook over those indoor fires? What did they eat when there was food? And what did they do when there wasn't? The next video explores the meals of Jesus' world, the grain, the oil, the labor it took just to eat once a day. If this kind of history matters to you, if you want to keep seeing the real world behind the stories, subscribe. We're not done walking through first-century Judea. We're just getting started.